Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I recently came across an article by Timothy Snyder, and if you don't know, Timothy Snyder is basically a right-wing sort of neo-Cold Warrior. He's one of these mainstream right-wing historians who focus on shitting on the Soviet Union, and in his book that came out a few years ago called Bloodlands, he was pretty much equating the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, claiming that they were equally bad, or like right-wing historians usually like to do, claim that the Soviet Union was actually worse than Nazi Germany. However, I came across this article by Snyder called Hitler vs. Stalin, Who Killed More, where he actually does a couple of things that were a bit unexpected. This article is definitely Soviet bashing, like it does accuse the Soviet Union of all kinds of things, and it exaggerates all kinds of things and whatnot. It's still definitely very anti-Soviet, but it's markedly more reasonable than what I would expect from Snyder. Listen to this. Quote, "In the second half of the 20th century, Americans were taught to see both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as the greatest of evils. Hitler was worse because his regime propagated the unprecedented horror of the Holocaust, the attempt to eradicate an entire people on racial grounds. Yet, Stalin was also worse because his regime killed far more people, tens of millions it was often claimed, in the endless wastes of the gulag. For decades, and even today, this confidence about the difference between the two regimes, quality versus quantity, has set the ground rules for the politics of memory. Even historians of the Holocaust generally take for granted that Stalin killed more people than Hitler, thus placing themselves under greater pressure to stress the special character of the Holocaust, since this is what made the Nazi regime worse than the Stalinist one." That's actually a pretty accurate summary of the situation. It's definitely the prevailing mainstream view that the Soviets supposedly killed more people than the Nazis. And obviously, people who have looked into this then get called like, oh, you're just a lying communist or something when we say, well, actually, no, the Soviet Union didn't kill nearly as many people as Nazi Germany. Then we get accused of being a lying communist and our sources are just communist propaganda and whatever. Now, of course, there have been historians, the so-called New School of Sovietology or the New School of Soviet History, with people like Arch Getty, who have actually looked at primary sources and archival sources from the Soviet archives and things like that, and have come to the conclusion that, no, actually the Soviets didn't kill nearly as many people as the Nazis did. But those people have always, despite the fact that they are not communists, despite the fact that those historians are all Western liberals or conservatives and not communists, they've still never been mainstream. They've always been marginal. So I think it's interesting that even Snyder, who is such a vehement anti-communist, and definitely in the mainstream now, even he was saying stuff like this. So, okay, he continues, he says, quote, "The total number of non-combatants killed by the Germans, about 11 million, is roughly what we had thought," which is actually a pretty low number because we know for a fact they killed way more than that. Like, that's just the Holocaust. But when they were occupying the Soviet Union, they killed at least as many people as that on top of it. He continues, "The total number of civilians killed by the Soviets, however, is considerably less than we had believed. We know now that the Germans killed more people than the Soviets did." He admits it. He says it. To me, this is unbelievable, like, because they've been lying about this for such a long time that when they finally admit the truth, it's kinda hard to even accept it. For such a long time, the capitalist historians like to use two sources. Solzhenitsyn, the guy who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, who claimed that the Soviet Union killed 60 million people, which is absurd, but that's what Solzhenitsyn said, and the West, would use that number. If you see those anti-communist memes like, oh, like, look how the Soviets killed more than Hitler, they might use the Solzhenitsyn number. The other number is 20 million, which comes from Robert Conquest. Conquest was a Western anti-communist historian operating during the Cold War. He used to be employed by the British Secret Service and is obviously very biased and unreliable. His books would use any sources that were anti-Soviet, regardless if they were accurate or not. For instance, he used a lot of Nazi sources against the Soviet Union. So, yeah, there's the 60 million number and the 20 million number. Since forever we've been saying that those numbers are ridiculous and not true, and we've always been called like, oh, you're such a lying communist, you're like a Holocaust denier, and yeah. Well, now, even Timothy Snyder is admitting that those numbers are false, so, what does it mean? I don't know. Maybe the political climate is changing, I don't know. They're finally admitting it. Now, of course, he still has to claim that the Soviet Union was racist and, like, tried to ethnically cleanse people and ethnically cleanse Ukraine and whatnot, he still has to make all kinds of accusations against the Soviet Union. But here's another informative part. He says, quote, "It turns out that with the exception of the war years, a very large majority of the people who entered the gulag left alive." Well, to any reasonable person that shouldn't be a surprise. That most people who went to prison, they just served their 5 to 10 years and they get out. But the picture painted by anti-communist propaganda is that everybody just goes in and nobody comes out, ever. I have shown in a previous video that the mortality in the gulags in peacetime was 2 to 5%, I think. But he makes a very important distinction. He says, with the exception of the war years. The mortality in peacetime was actually pretty low. Like I said, like around 3%, 5% at max was the mortality rate. So that means that 95% of the people survived, which is a much better survival rate than, for instance, the prisoners in the French labor camps of the same time, the French penal colonies. I'll put a link in the description to a documentary about one of these French prison labor camps, where the majority of the prisoners died.
The largest camp was on the mainland in the prison city of Saint-Laurent. This was where the convicts first arrived, and where the majority of them served their sentences. And less than 5,000 actually lived to see the day of their release.
Any other civilized nation would have given us a chance to remake our lives, instead of sending us to death. Some of us committed the first felony in an excess of folly, and we are in no sense criminals. Now we are locked up like animals in close quarters with assassins and thieves.
So yeah, most people in the gulag didn't die, but he says with the exception of the war years. So obviously, when the war happens, infrastructure collapses, food supplies do not get delivered, whatnot. So if you look at the mortality figures, you see that in the war years, the mortality goes to 10 to 15%. So it's drastically higher than during peacetime. Okay, so then he continues. Judging from the Soviet records we now have, the number of people who died in the gulag between 1933 and 1945, while both Stalin and Hitler were in power, was on the order of 1 million. So, not 20 million, not 60 million, not 100 gazillion trillion, but 1 million. But let's analyze that a bit further. He says, we know that the mortality was really low in peacetime, but it was pretty high in the wartime. Meaning that vast majority of these people died as a result of the war. They died during the war because of the harsh conditions created by the war. Would you blame that on Stalin or would you blame that on Hitler? Think about that. Snyder is saying that this is the fault of the Soviet Union that people died when the Nazis attacked them. This is why I don't really think the Gulag argument makes sense, because most of the people who died in the Gulag died when the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union as a direct result of the war. So it's not even inherent to the Gulag system itself. Then he talks about the shootings. He uses the pretty much widely accepted number at this point, where he says that around 600,000 people were shot. Those are actual numbers. You can say that this is the death toll of Stalinism, I suppose, would be the 600,000 people who were shot. Now, I'm gonna complicate that a bit more as well, but to me, that's not as problematic. Like, when you try to blame the government for the war victims and for the prisoners who died in the war, to me that is very sketchy, but these 600,000 people were at least shot by the Soviet government. Now, he talks about the Ukrainian famine. He says that, quote, the largest human catastrophe of Stalinism was the famine of 1930 to 1933, in which more than 5 million people died. And he even goes on to say, inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine who died in 1932 to 1933 were victims of a deliberate killing policy related to nationality. So he's actually advocating the whole Holodomor terror famine theory, which should kind of indicate just how right-wing Snyder is, because most of these moderate historians don't call the Holodomor a deliberate killing policy or something. They just say that it was a famine. I would say that on one end you have Professor Mark Tauger. He's not a historian, he's a famine expert. And he says that the famine was purely caused because of bad harvests, and it had no political element. And regardless of the political system, regardless of policy, the famine would have happened because the harvest failed. or 2 harvests failed. That would be Professor Mark Tauger. Then you have people like Arch Getty, Wheatcroft, people like that, who would say that the famine was predominantly caused by the failure of the harvest, but perhaps mismanagement contributed to it, or perhaps some policies contributed to it, but it was caused by drought and the failure of the harvests. And then you have the crazy right-wingers who say that, no, the Soviet Union carried out the famine on purpose. I don't even know how you could say that, because how could the Soviet Union deliberately cause the harvest to fail? That's not possible. They don't control the weather. I know it's a bit of a meme to talk about controlling the weather, but it's impossible. So yeah, whatever. But Snyder, still in this article, he advocates the deliberate terror famine theory. The Holodomor theory was actually popularized by the Nazis and American pro-Nazi sources. I'm gonna put a link in the description to a book. It's called Fraud, Famine, and Fascism, which discusses Holodomor propaganda, especially Holodomor Nazi propaganda. Okay, so he says, 1 million people die in prison because of the war. 5 million people die in the famine. Well, maybe. That's a bit of a high estimate. Some people say it's 2 million, 3 million, whatever. He says 5 million. I've seen even higher estimates, but whatever. The point is, if you compare these, he talks about the quantity of deaths versus the quality. Like, the Nazis killed more, but they also did it in an industrialized, deliberate fashion. But the Soviet Union, okay, you have people who die in prison because of reasons outside of their control, mainly the Nazi invasion. Then you have the famine, which they did not cause, which they tried to prevent. They actually sent food aid to Ukraine to try to prevent deaths. Now, obviously, Snyder claims that the Soviets did the famine on purpose, but the point is, when you compare something like the Holocaust, like the deliberate killing of people in an industrialized fashion, to the stuff that happened in the Soviet Union, there's no comparison. The Soviets didn't have a deliberate extermination policy or something. The people who died during the war because of the Nazis, as well as the famine victims, to me, it's pretty questionable to blame those things on the government. So that's why Marxists typically just point to the 600,000 people who were actually killed by the government. But if you say that the Soviets killed 600,000, while the Nazis killed, I don't know, 11 million in the Holocaust and like another 20 plus million in the Soviet Union and whatnot, then they don't seem the same at all. So he tries to keep the Nazi figure down, because he says like, okay, 11 million people died in the Holocaust. But he ignores all the other deaths, even all the civilian deaths caused by the Nazis. He tries to keep it down to that 11 million. Then he tries to lift the Soviet number to meet that. He tries to say, okay, there was a famine, so I'm gonna give you the maximum death estimate for that, and I'm gonna blame it on the government, even though I really can't. Then he's gonna take the victims who died in prison because of war conditions. He's gonna try to blame that on the Soviets and not on the people who started the war, who invaded them, the Nazis. Then he claims like, okay, the Soviets could have killed like 6 million people. So therefore, Nazism and communism is still the same because, I mean, the reasoning, it's really forced. He tries really hard to twist the facts to make it seem that the two countries were even remotely similar. However, there is a marked change. You might ask yourself, well, okay, so Snyder is still a terrible right-wing propagandist who twists facts, who clearly has an anti-Soviet bias, who clearly tries to equate the Soviet Union to Nazi Germany, and all that. So isn't this just like the old Cold War propaganda? Well, actually it's not. And I'll tell you what the main difference is. I basically said it at the beginning of this video, is that he tries to twist the facts to support his erroneous conclusion. At least he doesn't really lie. When Solzhenitsyn said that the Soviet Union killed 60 million people in the gulag, it's clearly a lie. When Conquest said that the Soviet Union killed 20 million people in the gulag, it's clearly a lie. Now, Snyder doesn't really lie in the same way. We know that during the war, almost 1 million people died in the prison. And we don't know exactly, but it's fair to say that several million people died in the famine. So those are facts. He's not lying about that. But then he tries to blame them on the government, which is, to me, dishonest. I'm sure you see the difference. At least he didn't make up the numbers or something. The numbers are there. The historical events took place. It's just a matter of who is to blame. We've spoken about the famine before many times, but Basically, the 1930s famine was the last major famine of the Soviet Union, with the exception of the war and the immediate result of the war. That was the last famine. But until that point, Russia had always been chronically starving. If you think about it like that, it seems a bit weird to say, okay, Russia starves continuously during the Russian Empire, during the Kerensky government, during the Lenin government, then Stalin comes in power, and what? You think famine is gonna stop overnight? No. They had famine in 1905, they had famine in 1911, famine in 1913, famine in 1914, 1917, 1921, 1923. Actually, the early 20s famine was probably the worst in Soviet history because it was caused by the Civil War. Then they start having problems with food again in 1927, and finally we have the early 1930s famine. Clearly, a continuation of a long trend. The country was really poor, and they were never food secure until they industrialized. When they industrialized, the food problem was solved, and that's why they didn't have famines anymore. That's why to blame the famine on the government is a bit questionable, because famine was so frequent regardless of what kind of government they had. It was basically an inevitable result of being a really poor country, and expecting anything else would be kind of weird. And to then say that, oh, this famine was a direct result of socialism, not a result of the country just being poor, but it was a result of socialism, and they did it on purpose. Like what? They cause an economic catastrophe on purpose because what? They're mean? This was during when they tried to industrialize. They didn't want the harvests to fail during that time. I just thought it was interesting that even Snyder basically admits that all the Cold War numbers about deaths in tens of millions and whatnot are baseless and false.